The first days of the record begin with the sound of the forge, steady, unembellished, a cadence that seemed older than the settlement itself and older still than the men who claimed dominion over it. The forge stood at the edge of the clearing where the muddy road bent toward the plantation house, its timbers blackened by years of smoke, and its iron tools arranged in rows that suggested both order and fatigue. Marilla, the blacksmith's daughter, moved among them each morning with the same restrained precision with which her father had taught her to walk, to lift, to observe, and, most importantly, to remain still when others grow restless. Her days at the anvil began long before the sun broke the heavy line of swamp mist along the horizon. She stirred the coals, pumped the bellows, sorted the horseshoes by size, and listened to the distant voices carried across the thinning dark. The overseer shouting for the morning roll, a child coughing near the slave quarters, a mule balking against the weight of an overloaded cart. There had been no moment in her memory when she had not known this soundscape, this combination of iron striking iron and human breath straining beneath unseen burdens. It shaped her as firmly as any parental guidance could, and in the spaces between these noises, she cultivated the quiet inwardness that allowed her to navigate a world organized around a hierarchy she had no means to challenge. The settlement itself, though marked on no official map with any consistency, was spoken of in neighboring counties as a place where fortunes had been made and unmade with suspicious speed, a place whose humid air carried both the sweetness of river blossoms and the sour smell of debts rotting beneath genteel manners. The plantation houses, 2 large ones and several lesser homes, rose from the soft earth like stern declarations of ownership, their balconies warped by seasonal rains, and their windows oscillating between polished clarity and streaked abandonment, depending on who lived, who died, or who fled during a particular year. The smaller cabins clustered near the stables and fields bore the look of structures that had been built not to last but to serve: rough logs, uneven roofs, and doors that could not fully close against the persistent damp. It was in these lower spaces that Marilla spent most of her days delivering forged items, collecting repair orders, and listening to the clipped exchange of instructions that passed between masters and those beneath them with the efficiency of a well-rehearsed routine. Social order in the settlement relied less on explicit laws than on an unspoken choreography of glances, silences, and deference. Every white authority figure, planter, overseer, visiting merchant, stood above Marilla, and they made no effort to disguise their expectations that she remember her place in the rigid structure that governed every interaction. Despite being freeborn, she occupied a low rung in the mental hierarchy maintained by those who believed wealth or skin color endowed them with the right to command. Children of plantation owners addressed her with the offhand brusqueness reserved for servants. Overseers gestured at her with the same casual authority they used on those forced to labor in the fields. Even the mistresses, with their controlled voices and lace-trimmed cuffs, spoke to her in tones shaped not by cruelty, but by an assumption of natural superiority. In such an environment, Marilla learned early that self-effacement was a skill necessary for survival, and she developed an extraordinary capacity for perceiving tension without revealing any reaction to it. The landscape around her reinforced this sense of silent oppression. The humidity pressed upon skin like a persistent hand. The air carried a heaviness that blurred the distinction between breath and burden. Moss dripped from branches in long, gray-green strands, and the muddy paths between the smithy, the stables, and the main house remained slick even days after rainfall. The river, broad, slow, and deceptively calm, curved a mile away, giving the settlement a sense of isolation, as though it were suspended between the living world and some dimmer counterpart. Nights brought little relief. Insects hummed in relentless waves, and the low croak of frogs echoed across the fields in tones that sometimes resembled distant human voices. It was within this atmospheric pressure that the subtleties of human interaction became magnified, and every gesture gained meaning in the constrained environment. It was also within these first days that Marilla began to notice small irregularities, subtle dissonances that made her pause in the middle of routine tasks. At times, as she distributed freshly forged tools to the field hands, she caught furtive glances exchanged between them, glances that communicated alarm, suspicion, or knowledge of something concealed. A stable boy, ordinarily quiet and obedient, flinched when a mistress called his name, not with the usual timidity, but with a kind of anticipatory dread. Two women in the kitchen exchanged whispered remarks that ceased abruptly the moment Marilla stepped through the doorway to deliver repaired hooks. Even the overseer, whose loud voice ordinarily dominated every scene, seemed to carry an undercurrent of agitation when he strode through the yard, muttering about accounts unpaid and letters unanswered. Rumors circulated with greater frequency than in past seasons. Some spoke of mounting debts owed by the master of the largest plantation house, debts that had forced him to sign papers late into the night, his hands trembling as if the ink itself burned his skin. Others whispered of a child whose sudden illness had taken her life before dawn, her death too quiet and too convenient for those who understood the household's inner tensions. A quarrel had allegedly erupted near the stables between the master and one of his relatives, their angry voices overheard by a field worker who described the argument as the kind that ends in disappearance. These murmurs reached Marilla not through direct conversation, but through half-caught sentences drifting through open windows, through glances that lingered too long, and through the delicate shift in posture when someone walked past her as though bracing against a suspicion they dared not articulate. It was on the third morning of the record, though the precise date is debated in later testimonies, that Marilla encountered the ledger. Her father had sent her to the main house to deliver a set of newly shod horseshoes and to inquire about additional orders for the coming week. The housekeeper directed her toward the study, where drawers of tools awaited repair. The room, dimly lit by the half-lowered shutters, smelled of paper, smoke, and spirits. On the large desk near the center of the room lay a book whose cover had been left partially open, as though someone had been called away mid-entry. Marilla, in the course of gathering the rusty hinges and cracked iron fittings for the forge, saw the ledger's exposed page and paused. The columns of numbers did not align, and the sums, crossed out and rewritten multiple times, suggested panic rather than careful accounting. Several names appeared in the margins, some accompanied by question marks, others by symbols she did not recognize. Without touching the book, she leaned closer, absorbing the irregularities not as an act of curiosity, but as part of her instinctive habit of noticing anything that could affect the delicate balance of her surroundings. Before she withdrew, she caught sight of a folded letter beneath the ledger, sealed but with one corner torn as if the wax had been disturbed prematurely. She did not open it, but its presence lodged in her mind with a significance she could not yet define. As she left the study, a minor act of defiance occurred in the yard, one that would later be recalled by several witnesses as an early indication that the household's stability was beginning to erode. A young worker, barely in his teens, refused an order from the overseer to carry a sack of grain twice his weight. His refusal was not loud or dramatic. He simply stood frozen, shaking his head, his eyes fixed on some unseen point beyond the overseer's shoulder. The rebuke he received was swift and predictable, yet his defiance lingered in the air with a tension that unsettled even the most seasoned observers. Marilla watched the exchange from the doorway, her expression neutral, but there was a flicker in her eyes, an acknowledgement that something had shifted and that such shifts rarely came without consequence. The mistress of the house made an unexpected decision that same afternoon, one that struck many as the first sign of a destabilizing change in leadership. She ordered that several workers be reassigned from the fields to the household, claiming she required additional assistance with domestic tasks, though it was widely known that she preferred the company of servants trained for genteel service. Rumors suggested she no longer trusted her husband to manage affairs in the fields, while others believed she sought to intercept whispered messages passing among the workers. The reassignment disrupted established routines and produced a ripple of discomfort across the settlement, for any alteration in the fragile machinery of labor tended to reveal or create fractures that might otherwise remain hidden. Throughout these events, Marilla carried herself with a composure that she had honed over years of observing others from a position of near invisibility. Yet even she could not fully conceal the quiet moral burden she carried, the memory of past losses she seldom spoke of. Her mother had died when Marilla was still young, succumbing to a fever that swept through the settlement, and her father's weary silence in the years that followed had taught her the value of containing grief within the confines of one's own chest. There were moments, particularly in the stillness of the forge's early hours, when she felt the weight of these memories pressing against her ribs like an unspoken confession. She did not seek sympathy, nor did she trust anyone in the settlement enough to share the full extent of her emotions. Yet the subtle heaviness in her expression betrayed a mind accustomed to loss and to the quiet endurance that follows it. The oppressive tone of these first days intensified as the humidity thickened with the arrival of late summer storms. Thunder rolled in distant, ponderous waves across the sky, and the air inside the cabins grew so dense that candles struggled to maintain steady flames. Clothing clung to skin, boots sank into mud that seemed to swallow sound. The main house's wooden floors, ordinarily polished to a dull sheen, creaked beneath each step with an almost accusatory resonance. In this suffocating atmosphere, every small detail took on the quality of evidence. The grain of timber swollen from moisture, the smudge of soot on a windowsill, the imprint of a boot that suggested hurried movement during the night. Marilla, attentive to such minutiae, found her senses heightening with each passing hour, as though the settlement were whispering secrets through the textures of its own decay. On the final evening of Part I's time frame, the forge's fire dimmed earlier than usual. Marilla stood outside the doorway, her hands resting on the handle of a cooling hammer. The settlement lay before her, shrouded in dusk, the plantation house glowing faintly from its upper windows. She watched a lone figure move across the yard with a lantern, its light flickering in irregular patterns that betrayed a trembling hand. The distant murmur of voices carried through the humid air, low, urgent, indistinct. Something had happened or was about to happen, and though she could not yet name it, she sensed it as one might sense a storm before the wind shifts. She inhaled the thick scent of wet earth and smoke, and for a moment she felt the full weight of the world pressing inward, urging her not toward fear, but toward awareness, as if some hidden ledger of fate had begun tallying its accounts in earnest. And in that heavy silence, Marilla knew, though she would not speak it aloud, that the fragile order of the settlement was beginning to unravel, strand by invisible strand. The first signs of true disturbance in the settlement surfaced quietly, as most consequential events tend to do, not with panic or spectacle, but with a subtle shift in atmosphere, as though the very air had thickened with unspoken tensions. Days had passed since Marilla's discovery of the ledger and the strange reassignment of labor within the plantation household. The weather had not improved. Humidity clung to the skin like a film, and tempers frayed under the constant weight of heat. In this oppressive climate, the unexplained events began without any warning. The master of the main plantation house, a man whose voice once boomed across the yard with rehearsed authority, fell ill under circumstances that remained unclear even to those closest to him. One morning he simply did not rise from his bed, and the doctor summoned from a neighboring county found no fever, no injury, no visible cause. The master's skin appeared pale and clammy, his eyes unfocused, his breath uneven. The doctor ordered tonics, cold compresses, and rest, but none offered improvement. The mistress, whose composure had been fraying since the ledger's irregularities came to light, paced the hallway outside his room, her embroidered sleeves trembling each time she touched the doorframe. The master's illness cast an immediate pall over the settlement. Workers approached their tasks with heightened caution, glancing toward the house with expressions that betrayed fear rather than concern. The overseer carried himself with a new edge of impatience, barking orders that echoed through the yards with excessive force, as if volume alone might dispel the growing unease. A few whispered that the illness must be punishment for debts unpaid or for sins committed behind closed doors. Others suspected poison, though no one dared to say so in anything above a whisper. The more superstitious murmured about curses or spirits angered by some wrongdoing the household had tried to bury. Marilla listened without comment, absorbing each rumor as though adding it to a mental tapestry she had long been weaving. Around this same time, a weapon went missing from the locked storeroom adjacent to the forge. It was a pistol, old, heavy, and seldom used, yet its absence alarmed the overseer, who had kept the storeroom key on his belt for years without incident. The lock showed no signs of forced entry, the hinges no damage. When questioned, he insisted the weapon had been in its place only the day before. His agitation was palpable, and he accused several workers of theft, pacing back and forth in front of the cabins with a fury that seemed disproportionate to the object lost. Marilla, observing from a short distance while delivering nails and tools, could not ignore a detail the overseer seemed not to notice: a faint scratch on the wooden frame of the storeroom door, as though someone had tried to steady their hand while manipulating the lock. The scratch was thin, almost invisible unless the light struck it just so, but its presence lingered in her thoughts long after she returned to the forge. Later that same afternoon, a field worker was found injured near the edge of the clearing. He lay half-conscious, his arm twisted at an unnatural angle, a deep gash running across his forearm. He muttered incoherently about hearing voices in the dark, about seeing someone move near the tree-line, though his account shifted with each retelling. Some dismissed his claims as delirium brought on by pain or exhaustion. Others exchanged troubled glances, for the settlement had always relied on predictable routines and familiar faces. The idea of a stranger moving unseen through the trees unsettled even those who did not believe in spirits. The overseer, visibly shaken, insisted the injury must have been accidental, a fall, perhaps, or an encounter with a wild animal, though the shape of the gash suggested a sharp blade rather than a claw or branch. Marilla heard the conflicting theories as she tended the forge that evening, and the weight of unease settled over her like a second skin. In the days that followed, Marilla found herself unwittingly drawn to the center of these disturbances, not by any action of her own, but by proximity to those unraveling threads of the settlement's social machinery. Her deliveries brought her into contact with every part of the plantation household: the stables, where workers whispered behind cupped hands; the kitchen, where the cook stirred pots with unnecessary vigor; the main house, where hallways grew quieter with each passing day. She learned to read the tension in people's movements, the way their eyes darted toward shadows or lingered too long on closed doors. Her natural inclination toward observation, once a tool for survival, now positioned her as a silent witness to the unraveling order. It was during one of these routines that she noticed the first of several small details dismissed by others. On a doorframe leading to the house's second-floor corridor, she saw faint marks, almost imperceptible unless one leaned close. They were not scratches from furniture or careless handling of tools, but deliberate lines, vertical, parallel, and evenly spaced. The pattern resembled tally marks, though too shallow to be carved intentionally. She traced them lightly with her fingertip, feeling the minute ridge where the wood had been disturbed. When she mentioned them casually to the housekeeper, the woman brushed the matter aside with a nervous laugh, insisting they must have been caused by the children years ago. But the housekeeper's eyes betrayed a deeper concern, one she tried, and failed, to conceal. Another discovery followed soon after. Near the back of the stables, beneath a pile of straw used to line the stalls, Marilla found a handful of burned scraps. The pieces were small, curled, and blackened at the edges, the remnants of paper or cloth that someone had attempted to destroy completely. Only faint traces of ink remained, too incomplete to decipher, but enough to suggest that whatever information had been recorded there had been considered dangerous by someone. Marilla did not share this discovery with anyone. Instead, she pocketed one of the fragments, a piece no larger than a fingernail, examining it under the low light of the forge that evening. The ink had spread unevenly from the fire's moisture, but she believed she saw the remains of a signature or initial, though she could not be certain. A third detail emerged when a mistress from the neighboring plantation visited the main house. While assisting in polishing the entry hall sconces, Marilla overheard the woman complaining of a missing brooch, fine silver, engraved, worn for special occasions. She claimed it had vanished from her dressing table without explanation. The housekeeper murmured reassurances, suggesting it might simply have been misplaced or borrowed without permission. Yet Marilla noticed that the mistress's expression held something more than frustration, fear, perhaps, or suspicion directed toward unseen adversaries. Later that day, Marilla found a single pearl bead near the corner of the hall, one that matched the description of the brooch's ornamentation. It lay half hidden in the dust, overlooked by everyone except her. The bead's presence suggested the brooch had been in the house recently, contradicting the mistress's assumption of theft or misplacement, and implying that someone had moved quietly enough to carry jewelry through the hall without detection. As these details accumulated, the psychological tension within the settlement deepened. Workers walked in pairs when possible, casting nervous glances toward the woods. Conversations became briefer and quieter, and the usual exchanges of gossip turned into cryptic fragments of fear. Some whispered their suspicions openly, that someone within the household was orchestrating the chain of disturbances, that the master's illness was no natural malady, that the missing weapon had been stolen for a purpose not yet revealed. Others hid their concerns, maintaining stiff expressions and rigid routines, as though any admission of fear might invite further misfortune. Marilla found herself caught between conflicting impulses, remaining silent, as she had been trained to do by years of careful self-restraint, or intervening in the growing chaos by sharing what she had observed. Each option carried risks. Silence meant complicity if events spiraled beyond control. Speaking up could draw unwanted attention, placing her at the center of the household's suspicions. The dilemma weighed on her with increasing intensity, particularly at moments when she noticed someone watching her from a distance, their expression unreadable. She began to question whether her observant nature, which had protected her for so long, might now place her in danger, for those who notice too much are rarely seen as harmless. The turning point came late one evening when one of the workers, a man known for his reliability and steady demeanor, approached Marilla near the forge after the others had gone. His hands trembled as he held a folded slip of paper, its edges smudged from repeated handling. He confided that he had overheard a conversation between the mistress and the overseer, a heated exchange about missing funds and letters sent to the wrong recipient. The paper, he explained, contained a warning intended for one of the neighboring plantations, urging the recipient to take precautions. But he suspected the letter had been written too hastily and might have been delivered to the wrong person, perhaps even someone allied with those causing the disturbances. He asked Marilla to keep the information confidential, his voice shaking with desperation. She nodded, accepting the note without fully understanding why he had entrusted her with it. Yet his choice implied a dangerous faith in her discretion, a decision that would later be recognized as the first of several acts that drew her deeper into the unfolding conflict. Within the same week, a plan began to form among a small group of workers, quiet, fearful individuals who believed escape might be their only means of survival. They whispered of fleeing toward the river under cover of darkness, of navigating the swamp until they reached a safer region. Marilla overheard parts of their conversations while delivering supplies near the stables, though they did not know she listened. Their fear was palpable, and their desperation, though understandable, carried the risk of betrayal by someone who might reveal their intentions in exchange for favor or protection. Such betrayals had occurred before in the settlement's history, and the possibility hung over them like a heavy fog. Indeed, betrayal soon occurred from an unexpected source. A young woman in the household, anxious for the mistress's approval, informed her of the workers' escape plan in hopes of gaining favor. The mistress responded with alarm, summoning the overseer and instructing him to tighten surveillance around the cabins. The workers who had discussed escape found themselves watched more closely, their movements restricted, their whispers met with harsh rebukes. The betrayal created new fractures within the group, and suspicion spread like wildfire, leaving no relationship untouched. Marilla sensed the tension in every interaction, the way people avoided one another's eyes, the way accusations formed silently in the spaces between words. Amid this unraveling, Marilla's quiet observance became both her shield and her burden. Some sought her out for information, assuming she knew more than she revealed. Others viewed her with suspicion, wondering why she always appeared at the edges of significant events. She felt the weight of their scrutiny, the way their gazes lingered too long on her face, as though searching for guilt where none existed. The moral pressure grew with each passing day, forcing her to confront the question of alignment. With whom did she stand, and why? The settlement's slow burn of tension grew hotter still as secrecy deepened, cruelty sharpened its edges, and consequences tightened their grip on everyone trapped within the plantation's weakening social framework. The weight of the unknown pressed upon every soul, and though Marilla moved through her routines with the same measured composure as always, she sensed that each step she took drew her closer to a moment from which she would not be able to walk away unchanged. The weeks that followed the overseer's sudden collapse settled over the settlement like an unseasonable fog, heavy, persistent, and strangely muffling the ordinary movements of life. Whatever the physicians from Natchez declared in their tight-lipped confidence, whatever the neighbors speculated behind half-closed shutters, everyone on that strip of the lower Mississippi understood that the event was not isolated. Something had shifted in the house on the rise. Something quiet, deliberate, and ill-omened. And Marilla, soft-spoken, narrow-shouldered, habitually invisible Marilla, felt it ripple through her senses the way a blacksmith reads the quivering of iron as it cools. The forge became her refuge, though even that iron-smelling cave no longer gave the reassurance it once had. The bellows exhaled their dusty breaths. The anvil glistened with the sweat of countless hammerfalls. The chain tools hung motionless except when a wind from the swamp pressed through the cracked boards. But the space felt watched. Not by people. People rarely bothered with blacksmiths unless they needed something heavy mended or imposed, but by consequences, by unmade decisions stalking her with patient tread. She noticed it first in how the men spoke with one another. The plantation workers, field hands, stable boys, domestic servants. Their voices were clipped shorter than usual, their eyes drifting off into the road, to the water, to the sky, as though looking outward for signs rather than inward for comfort. One morning, while carrying a newly fixed stirrup to the stables, she overheard two domestics whispering near the back porch, their faces bloodless. "They won't say it," one murmured, "but the mistress is writing to her brother again. She says she needs oversight." "Oversight," the other echoed. "Or protection?" The first woman's eyes darted around. "Both. Word is she's convinced the man died of poison." Marilla slowed, barely breathing, though they did not notice her. The words settled into the air like a dark feather drifting down. Poison. She stepped away before they could turn and include her in their suspicion. It was not the truth. She knew that. The overseer had died not from any substance she mixed or any scheme she conducted, but from something that had festered in him long before his collapse. The quiet rot of debts, hidden abuse, enemies made with both slaves and free men, accounts falsified with casual arrogance. But coincidence was a fragile thing, and people who lived beneath hierarchy always looked upward for blame. Her father sensed something as well, though he never named it. His silences grew longer. When he heated iron, he no longer muttered observations or instructions, but watched his work with eyes reddened by more than smoke. One evening, as she swept metal filings into a bucket, he paused with the hammer resting on the anvil and asked, almost gently, "You been near the main house more than usual?" She did not raise her head. "They have more work than usual." "That ain't what I meant." He let the sentence stand between them like a raw, unfinished blade, dangerous to touch, dangerous to leave alone. Marilla said nothing. He said nothing more. But the next morning, she found him sitting outside before sunrise, elbows on his knees, staring toward the plantation as if waiting for something inevitable to crest the horizon. His posture trembled. She knew then that he feared not the authorities, nor the mistress's family, but the unseen undercurrent pulling at his daughter's movements. The incident that pushed suspicion into open air occurred during a week of oppressive storms. Thunder rolled through the swamplands like the echo of cannon fire, and with each night's rainfall the muddy roads became nearly impassable. Many of the animals sickened. The mistress's brother, the one she had summoned for oversight, was delayed by the swollen river. Tempers soured. It began with a disappearance, brief, but alarming enough to rattle the household. A bookkeeper named Harland, known for the narrow spectacles perched on his nose and his fastidious devotion to ledgers, failed to appear one morning. His bed was empty, though slept in, his boots were missing, and the door to his small room above the storehouse was ajar in a way that suggested haste rather than care. He returned by evening, drenched to the bone, trembling, but unharmed. Yet the explanation he offered, he had walked out for air, gotten turned around near the swamp, and wandered for hours, did not satisfy the mistress. She questioned him privately, her voice drifting through the thin wooden walls with a quiver that betrayed something more than fear, resentment. Marilla happened to be nearby, delivering a repaired lock for the smokehouse, when she heard the crack of the mistress's palm against Harlan's cheek, followed by a muffled sob. The mistress accused him of abandoning his post, of failing to complete the quarterly accounts, of withholding figures that might explain missing funds her late husband had allegedly misplaced before his death 2 winters earlier. "Everything is slipping from my hands," the mistress hissed, "and I will not have you adding to the disorder." Harlan murmured apologies. Marilla withdrew before she could catch more. But it was what happened 2 days later that truly shifted the balance. A weapon disappeared. Not one of the house pistols or hunting rifles, but a short-bladed skinning knife kept in the smokehouse, the sort used for livestock. It had been there one evening, and by morning it was gone. In ordinary times, such theft might have been blamed on a fox hunter or transient laborer, but the atmosphere of fear made the act a spark against dry tinder. The mistress demanded a search. Everyone was questioned, workers, servants, even Marilla's father. The overseer's replacement, a heavy-jawed man named Kittrell, stood with arms folded like a judge measuring guilt by posture. When it was Marilla's turn, she answered plainly. No inflection, no trembling. She had not seen the knife. She had no reason to. If she needed a blade, her father forged them. Kittrell watched her too long. Not suspicious exactly, but curious in a way that made her stomach constrict. He had noticed her composure, her certainty. People in her position were not expected to hold themselves with such stillness. They were expected to apologize, to avert their eyes, to shrink. The mistress observed her as well, but her gaze held something different, fear. Not of Marilla specifically, but of the shifting pattern of events around her, like a tapestry unraveling thread by thread. The turning point arrived a week later. The disappearance, the missing weapon, the growing dread, they culminated in a moment of raw confrontation. The mistress summoned the workers and household members to the courtyard at dusk, lanterns swinging in the thick air. Rain threatened again, thunder rumbling low. Harlan stood by her side, visibly shaken, a bruise still faint on his cheek. Kittrell flanked her other side, his arms crossed, jaw set. This settlement, the mistress announced, her voice wavering but stern, has allowed disorder to spread like rot. I will not tolerate lies or sabotage. Someone here knows what is happening. Someone here is hiding something. Her gaze swept over the crowd. Marilla felt it pause on her for a fraction too long. We will restore order, the mistress continued. I have written to the sheriff. A formal inquiry is coming. And before he arrives, I intend to have answers. A murmur rippled through the workers, fear mixed with resignation. An inquiry meant punishments. It meant forced confessions extracted by threats, or worse. Then Kittrell stepped forward. There's already evidence that someone has been sneaking into places they don't belong. That missing knife didn't walk off on its own. And I found tracks behind the smokehouse, small, light, barefooted, or near enough. The mistress stiffened. Barefooted. Kittrell nodded. Could be a child. Could be a woman. Could be anyone who doesn't wear boots regular. Several eyes drifted, almost imperceptibly, toward Marilla. Not accusing, simply registering possibility. Her pulse thudded once, hard. She kept her face still. Kittrell noticed. His expression flickered. Anyone want to speak on it? He asked. No one did. Silence swelled. Then Harlan spoke, so softly she nearly missed it. The ledger is missing pages. The mistress's head snapped toward him. What? Harlan swallowed. The one I'm revising. The winter accounts. Several sheets are gone. The crowd shifted uneasily. Missing pages from the ledger meant missing evidence. Evidence of money owed, money stolen, money spent improperly. The mistress trembled. Her voice sharpened. Who was near it? Again, eyes slid toward Marilla, not out of certainty, but because she was too silent, too observant, too often near the edges of places few others lingered. Kittrell's grip tightened on his belt. Maybe we ought to start by searching the quarters. Search everything, the mistress commanded. Every room, every trunk, every basket. Whoever is doing this will be found. Marilla felt the tension tighten around her like a noose. Search everything. She knew what they would find. Not guilt, but the kind of ambiguity that could be twisted into guilt. A scrap of burned paper she kept to remember a promise. A brooch someone had given her in misplaced kindness. A forged hinge piece she never returned to the storehouse. Circumstantial evidence. Enough to condemn. She stepped back, one foot shifting in the dirt. Kittrell saw. You, he said. Marilla. Step forward. Her breath caught. The crowd stirred, murmuring, sensing the moment tipping. Her father moved before he could stop himself, stepping between her and Kittrell. She's done nothing. Kittrell ignored him. Marilla. Step forward. The mistress's voice cracked like a whip. Obey him. And so, for the first time in the unfolding crisis, Marilla made a choice. Not passive, not incidental, but deliberate. She stepped forward and spoke. I know who took the pages, she said. Gasps rippled. Even Kittrell blinked. Her voice was steady, though her hands trembled behind her skirt. Harland. The bookkeeper made a strangled sound. Me? The mistress turned on him in outrage. Harland lifted his hands defensively. I didn't, I swear. Marilla continued, slow, calm, factual. He left that morning. He said he got lost, but his boots were clean. Not swamp muddy. Clean. And someone wiped the ink bottle near the ledger, the same ink he uses. The mistress inhaled sharply. Kittrell stepped toward Harland. He's lying, Harland stammered. She's lying. She's lying to protect someone. Search him, the mistress ordered. Kittrell grabbed Harland's satchel before the man could clutch it to his chest. He spilled its contents onto the ground. Papers, spectacles case, a small loaf of bread, a folded handkerchief, and a tightly rolled bundle of ledger sheets, edges torn. Harland collapsed to his knees. The crowd recoiled. The mistress's face drained of color. Kittrell hauled the man upright, snarling. It wasn't. I didn't, Harland gasped. I kept them because. But whatever reason he meant to give never reached completion. The mistress cut him off with a scream of fury. Take him to the cellar. The sheriff will hear this first. The workers dispersed in horrified silence as Harland was dragged away, pleading. And through it all, Marilla stood unmoving, her face unreadable, her pulse returning slowly to its steady rhythm. She had lied. But she had lied with precision, with purpose, with a motive she could barely name yet. And the power structure had shifted, not wholly, not safely, but undeniably. Later that night, lightning cracked across the sky, illuminating the plantation house like a condemned building awaiting judgment. The wind carried the sound of distant weeping. Marilla sat alone in the forge, staring at her reflection faintly visible in the cooled anvil. Her face looked older, harder, as if the decision she had made had carved a new line into her features. From outside, someone slipped a folded paper under the door. She approached cautiously, unfolding it beneath the lantern's glow. It was a torn scrap from the missing ledger sheets, one that had not been in Harland's satchel. A different hand had written a note along the margin. You are not the only one who knows what they did. Her breath shivered. The forge hissed as a stray drop of rain leaked through the roof. Someone else was involved. Someone had seen her lie and left this message not as a threat, but as an invitation. For the first time, Marilla understood that she was not merely reacting to events. She was being drawn into something larger, an unraveling that did not start with her and would not end until every secret buried in that settlement surfaced. And she, patient, watchful Marilla, would not turn away. The days that followed the discovery of the ledger pages had the quality of a tightening noose, not through overt accusation, but through a gradual, suffocating constriction of every movement within the plantation's boundaries. The mistress retreated to her room with the shutters fastened against the light, summoning the overseer and a trembling handful of trusted servants for whispered conferences that stretched long into the night, their silhouettes flickering behind candlelit curtains like figures trapped inside a lantern. Rumors seeped outward from that shuttered room with the persistence of swamp moisture. Rumors of debts finally exposed, of property improperly mortgaged, of a death 2 winters earlier that the neighbors had politely accepted as natural, but which now, under this new scrutiny, seemed to have been accompanied by unrecorded withdrawals and quiet threats. The household, once rigidly stratified, began to dissolve into layers of suspicion. No one spoke to another without glancing around first, and no gesture, however small, escaped the quiet, hunger-eyed attention of those who feared that the next disappearance might demand a scapegoat. Marilla moved through this atmosphere with the contained stillness of one who has already crossed an unseen threshold and now feels every consequence approaching in steady, unalterable increments. The message left in the forge gnawed at her not as a threat, but as an unfamiliar recognition, suggesting the presence of another observer operating in the margins where power frayed and truth became dangerous. Each time she stepped from the forge into the oppressive humidity of the yard, her senses sharpened to the smallest irregularities. The faint drag of a boot print near the well that had not been there the previous day, a thin ribbon of smoke twisting from the direction of the quarters long before cooking fires were usually lit, a subtle unevenness in the porch boards beneath the mistress's window, as though someone had stood too long in that place, listening to the frantic rustlings within. By the third evening, as thunder gathered in the west, and the air thickened until breathing felt like swallowing warm river water, the internal structure of the plantation seemed to bow under its own concealed weight. Harland remained locked in the cellar, his muffled pleas emerging through the floorboards of the main house, like the echo of something dying underground. Kittrell patrolled the property with a restless, predatory energy that betrayed his uncertainty more clearly than any spoken admission could have. And the mistress, pale and unmoored, paced through rooms whose foundations, economic, social, and moral, she now understood had never been strong enough to carry the burdens placed upon them. It was during this period of heightened tension, as the entire settlement braced itself for the arrival of the sheriff and the formal inquiry promised by the mistress, that the final unraveling began. A storm approached, its swollen clouds dragging shadows across the fields, and with the storm came a sense of impending judgment. The workers who had once tried to maintain a semblance of order within their tasks, carrying water, tending animals, repairing tools, now performed their duties with the mechanical resignation of those awaiting a verdict. Their glances followed Marilla whenever she passed, not with accusation, but with an ambiguous calculation, as though they recognized that whatever had begun in whispers and missing pages had advanced into a sphere where their own fates were entangled with her quiet choices. When the storm broke at dusk, the wind tore through the branches with a violence that stripped away the last veneer of stability. Lightning illuminated the house on the rise, its windows glowing like startled eyes, and the clap of thunder rattled the very rails of the fence that enclosed the yard. It was in this moment, when nature itself seemed to echo the internal collapse of the household, that the final confrontation began, not with a single dramatic instance, but through a convergence of accumulated tensions that had long sought release. Marilla had gone to the forge, seeking the familiar shelter of coals and ironwork, when she noticed a faint metallic taste in the air, a sign of blood or old rust carried by the wind. The lantern hanging at the entrance flickered erratically, and when she stepped outside, she saw that the smokehouse door stood slightly ajar despite the storm. The missing knife, the one whose disappearance had sparked the search and accusations, had yet to be found. The open door implied that someone had returned to the scene of the theft or intended to retrieve what they had hidden there. But as she approached, rain slashing across her face, she realized that the door had not been opened by careful hands. The wind alone could not have forced it from its latch. Inside, the air hung heavy with dampness and the scent of salted meat, but beneath that familiar odor was a darker undertone, the smell of sweat, desperation, and a faint note of iron that confirmed what she had sensed from the doorway. Someone had bled here. The traces were minimal, a smear near the threshold, a darkening of sawdust beneath one of the hooks, but they were enough to suggest that the missing knife had returned to use, not for livestock, but for something far more consequential. That was the moment when she understood that the fragile equilibrium of the plantation had already shattered, and that the storm only served as a backdrop for the chaos unfolding within. She stepped back into the rain, the wind pulling at her clothing, and her gaze lifted to the main house where a single window glowed brighter than the rest, as though a fire had been lit too fiercely in a room meant only for lamplight. The mistress's window. The oppressive architecture of the place, the broad porch, the tall columns, the heavy shutters, seemed to lean into the wind with a kind of groaning fatigue, and Marilla felt in her bones that whatever was occurring inside would not remain contained for long. She crossed the yard slowly, each step sinking into mud that attempted to hold her back, as though the land itself recognized the irreversible threshold she approached. The workers who lingered beneath the eaves of the quarters watched her cross without speaking, their faces etched with a dread shaped by years of punishment and inherited pain. When Marilla reached the porch, the echoes from inside the house carried through the doorframe. Not voices exactly, but the indistinct swell of agitation, furniture scraped across wood, the thud of footsteps that moved too swiftly to be purposeful and too erratic to be ordinary. She stepped into the foyer, the air inside warm and stale, scented faintly with lavender and the sharper odor of fear. The house seemed to vibrate from within, as though some internal force pressed against the walls with frantic insistence. On the staircase lay a smear of mud, the same consistency as that by the smokehouse, and footprints that led upward, overlapping in disordered haste. Marilla followed them, her breath steady despite the rising tumult, and as she reached the landing the heat of the upper hallway pressed against her skin like the breath of a feverish animal. The mistress's door was open. Inside, the scene unfolded not as a moment of violence in progress, but as the wreckage of one already completed. The mistress lay collapsed near her writing desk, her hands extended as though she had lunged for something once within her reach. The lantern on the desk burned too brightly, throwing harsh shadows against the walls, revealing the overturned inkwell, the scattered letters, and the gaping drawer from which personal papers had been torn. The storm outside flared in jagged flashes of lightning that illuminated the contours of the mistress's face, drained of color yet not peaceful. Hers was the expression of someone who had seen the culmination of a fear long nurtured. The missing knife lay several feet away, its blade darkened by rainwater and something thicker that the storm had not washed clean. Nearby, droplets formed a faint trail across the floorboards, leading to the window where the shutters banged wildly in the wind, one hinge nearly broken. It was clear that someone had fled through that opening or attempted to, and the condition of the storm-battered lawn below suggested that the escape had been neither graceful nor entirely successful. Marilla's gaze returned to the mistress, whose breathing fluttered in shallow pulses. The storm muffled the sounds of the house, creating a strange, almost sacred stillness within the room. As Marilla knelt beside her, the woman's fingers twitched toward her throat, fumbling for a pendant that hung askew on its chain. The pendant, a small, ornate locket, had long been rumored to contain more than sentimental keepsakes. Debts, accounts, names. It was said the mistress kept records of every misdeed she feared might one day be used against her, insurance for future negotiations. Now that locket lay open, the tiny folded notes inside soaked with rain. In that moment Marilla understood that the collapse was complete. The mistress, who had clung to authority with a grip sharpened by desperation, had been undone by the very tangle of secrets she sought to control. And whoever had fled through the window had acted not out of impulse, but from a deep, festering resentment or fear, the kind that grows in the shadowed corners of plantations where cruelty is currency and silence is survival. Yet even as she recognized this, Marilla felt an unmistakable shift in perspective, the weight of the moment pressing upon her not as a passive witness, but as an actor whose choices would now define the remaining trajectory of the settlement's fate. The storm, the blood, the open locket, the retreating footprints, all converged into a singular understanding that the time for observation had ended. The sheriff would arrive to a house in disarray, a mistress dying or already dead, a bookkeeper imprisoned, and an overseer whose authority derived solely from force rather than legitimacy. In such a scenario, the vulnerable would suffer first. Marilla rose, steady despite the storm that hammered against the walls. The house seemed to tilt around her, its structural timbers groaning under the force of wind. She moved toward the desk, where the mistress's final letters lay scattered in disarray. Among them, she found one written to a creditor in Natchez, detailing unpaid loans and the sale of human lives intended to offset them. Another letter, half-burned, referenced a hidden account book kept separate from the primary ledgers, containing entries that implicated nearly every figure of authority on the property in acts ranging from financial deceit to direct brutality. The wind tore a sheet from the desk and sent it spiraling across the room. Marilla caught it before it reached the open window and saw that it contained a list of names, workers, servants, children, followed by numbers that signified worth rather than identity. A ledger of flesh. A future auction that the mistress had intended to initiate before debts consumed her estate. The horror of it shimmered coldly beneath the storm's fury, and Marilla felt a familiar tightening in her chest that blended grief, rage, and a clarity she had never permitted herself to acknowledge until now. She understood then that the collapse of authority was not a crisis to fear, but a threshold that demanded action. The system that had held the settlement in its grip had cracked open, exposing its rotten core, and she stood in the brief interval before new power would impose itself again. In that interval, she possessed the opportunity, perhaps the obligation, to determine what fragments of the old order would be allowed to persist. Moving with deliberate care, she gathered the incriminating letters, the list of names, and the soaked fragments of the mistress's personal notes. She placed them inside a metal box from the corner of the room. Securing the latch with a piece of wire, she twisted into place with the practiced precision of someone accustomed to working with iron. Then she extinguished the lantern, allowing the room to fall into semi-darkness illuminated only by lightning, and stepped back into the hallway. Below, the house had begun to fill with voices, the overseer shouting instructions, the workers murmuring anxiously, the storm amplifying every sound until the entire structure seemed alive with fear. The final disappearance, the mistress's final breath, whether it lingered or had already ceased, would ignite a conflagration of accusation, panic, and retaliation. The overseer would seek someone to blame. Someone would name Marilla. Someone would attempt to silence her. Someone would flee into the storm. But Marilla moved down the staircase with a calm forged from necessity. She carried the metal box not as evidence for the sheriff, but as a shield for those whose names were trapped within its rust-stained confines. She felt the weight of her decision settling across her like a mantle, neither righteous nor vengeful, but simply necessary, shaped by years of witnessing cruelty that the larger world refused to acknowledge. When she reached the bottom of the stairs, the overseer turned toward her, his face contorted by the storm's wild light and the knowledge that the house under his watch had fallen into chaos. His posture stiffened, and the air between them thickened with a silent accusation. His hand lay near the handle of his belt knife, the only symbol of authority he could still claim. Yet Marilla continued forward, her expression unreadable, her steps measured. The moment stretched like the final second before a hammer strikes iron, when all potential futures reside in the space between movement and impact. The storm roared, the house shook, and somewhere behind them the mistress drew, or failed to draw, her final breath. The confrontation, when it came, would be decisive. She understood that survival, justice, and retribution had converged into a single blurred instinct. There was no separating them now. The world had already shifted in her direction, and she did not intend to turn away. In the days that followed the final collapse of the household, the settlement lay under a hush so heavy it seemed to press itself into the very grain of the cypress boards and the mud-choked paths, as if the land wished to memorialize the events without permitting a single voice to articulate them aloud. The first official record came from an itinerant clerk dispatched from a neighboring county, a man whose boots sank deep into the softened ground and whose quill scratched across paper with the anxious rhythm of someone attempting to impose structure upon circumstances that resisted all forms of categorization. His report noted, with bureaucratic indifference, the absence or incapacity of multiple members of the household, the unaccountable misslaying of valuable property, and the unusual atmosphere of hesitation and dread among those workers who remained on the grounds. He did not ask why so many doors were left open, why certain rooms bore the faint scent of smoke and rainwater, or why the last surviving member of the owning family seemed to have abandoned the place without collecting even the most basic objects of personal importance. He simply signed his name at the bottom of the page and left, as though eager to distance himself from a place that no longer obeyed the expectations of civilized order. Marilla walked the property with a slow, deliberate pace, her steps echoing in corridors once dense with the noise of authority and command. The rooms, stripped of voices, resembled hollow vessels into which memory poured itself with oppressive clarity. She passed the parlor where the mistress once hosted visitors, the air still carrying a faint perfume that had seeped into the upholstery over years of rigid formality. She entered the master's office where the ledger, now hers by default or abandonment, lay open on the desk, its columns of inked debts no longer bearing the weight of future threat, for those who had wielded financial power were now gone or scattered. Outside, in the yard, the tools she and her father had repaired for the plantation workers were still arranged in neat rows, though the hands that once employed them were themselves displaced, lingering in nearby shacks, while waiting to learn whether anyone remained with authority to issue orders. And throughout the estate, the humidity clung to every surface with a thick persistence, as though the air itself was reluctant to release any part of what had transpired. Rumors circulated among the settlement's remaining inhabitants with the furtive circulation of illicit currency. One version claimed that illness had torn through the household in a matter of days, striking down those who had previously held dominion. Another insisted that a band of criminals drifting along the river had forced their way onto the property at night. A third, whispered only in doorways and behind water barrels, speculated that internal disputes among the owners had escalated into violence from which none emerged intact. None of these explanations accounted for the quiet precision with which the collapse had unfolded, nor for the steady composure of Marilla herself as she moved through each day with neither fear nor elation on her face. The settlement's people watched her with an uneasy mixture of respect and apprehension, uncertain whether she had been a victim elevated by chance or a participant who now stood in possession of everything left behind. She found herself lingering most often near the forge, where her father had worked with uncompromising discipline, shaping metal with a strength that seemed to radiate into the very structure of the building. The air still held the scent of old smoke and iron dust, though the flames had long since cooled. She would stand before the dormant furnace and feel, with a painful clarity, the layered history impressed upon each tool and timber, the years of labor performed without recognition, the quiet restrictions imposed upon her movements and aspirations, the moments of hope extinguished by others' whims, the silent calculations she had honed over time to navigate a world where every gesture could carry consequences. In the forge she sensed both the weight of her father's teachings and the stark reality that she alone now carried the knowledge of what had truly unfolded during the settlement's unraveling. It struck her that the space represented the last remaining link to a past that had both shaped and wounded her, and that standing within it offered no comfort, only the necessity of acknowledgement. Some workers chose to leave, traveling by riverboat or disappearing into the dense forests beyond the settlement, seeking distance from a place where too many questions lingered without answers. Others stayed, drawn by the hope of stability or the simple inertia of familiarity. A few, those who harbored ambitions of their own, approached Marilla with cautious propositions, suggesting arrangements in which she might assume control of the land in exchange for their ongoing labor. She listened, gave noncommittal responses, and allowed each individual to reveal more than they intended through their tone, posture, and choice of words. She understood that power was now a fluid entity, shifting according to perception rather than law, and that any decision she made would shape not only her own future, but the lives of those who depended upon the land for survival. Yet she also knew that seizing authority openly would invite scrutiny, while abandoning the property would produce a vacuum easily filled by opportunists far more ruthless than any who had ruled before. The few official documents that reached the settlement, statements from neighboring plantations, notices from county magistrates, and inquiries from debt collectors, bore the assumption that someone must eventually step forward to manage the estate. These letters arrived addressed to the absent masters or to vague titles such as current steward, revealing the outside world's reluctance to confront the unsettling reality of a plantation without an owner. Marilla stored these papers in a wooden box beneath the stairwell, not out of fear, but out of calculation, for she understood that their accumulation granted her a certain legitimacy if she ever chose to employ them. Their edges curled slightly in the humidity, and their ink faded in places, as though time itself conspired to erase the authority they once represented. Among the workers, a quiet debate emerged concerning Marilla's role in the events leading to the household's collapse. Some argued that she had simply been present at the wrong time, surviving in the same way one might survive a flood or a storm. Others pointed to her composure, her silence, and her tendency to appear wherever key incidents had taken place, suggesting that she possessed knowledge beyond what she admitted. A third group, smaller, but more intuitive, whispered that her survival was no accident at all, that she had outlasted her masters not by misfortune or grace, but by choice. These whispered suspicions, however, were always followed by a swift change of subject, for none wished to voice accusations aloud in a place where the boundaries of consequence had become dangerously unclear. Marilla herself avoided all forms of confession, whether spoken or internal. She neither justified nor condemned the choices she had made in the weeks prior. Instead, she moved through the hollowed estate with the detached observation of someone conducting an inventory of a life she had not sought, but now found herself responsible for. The tools in the forge, the neglected rooms in the main house, the ledger in the office, all represented fragments of a system that had once dictated every constraint upon her existence. Now these objects belonged to no one unless she chose otherwise. The realization brought neither triumph nor guilt, only a sense of inevitability, as though she had stepped into the natural continuation of a path forged long before she understood its direction. As night settled across the settlement in those weeks after the collapse, the silence thickened into an almost physical presence. The cicadas droned with a mournful persistence, the river carried its slow current past the abandoned docks, and the house itself seemed to exhale the accumulated weight of decades. In that quiet, Marilla often sat at a small table with a single candle, considering the question that had lingered at the edge of her thoughts since the final night of upheaval: whether history would remember the events at all, and if so, in what form. She understood that stories, once released into the world, rarely retained their original truths. They bent according to the fears and desires of those who repeated them. Already the settlement had begun to reshape its recollections, transforming her into a figure alternately pitied, mistrusted, or quietly admired. Over time, these conflicting perspectives would solidify into something resembling folklore, and the truth, complex, painful, and resistant to summary, would fade into the obscurity where most human tragedies eventually settle. Despite the heavy atmosphere, a few remained who sought answers with earnest if misguided determination. One elderly worker approached her after dusk one evening, speaking haltingly of justice, truth, and divine accounting. Marilla listened, her expression unreadable, offering no encouragement yet no denial. The woman left unsettled, carrying away more questions than she had brought. Another individual attempted to confront her with insinuations rooted in fear rather than knowledge, but Marilla's steady gaze and silence dissolved the accusation before it fully formed. Most others chose the safer path of avoidance, recognizing that studying her too closely risked revealing truths they were not prepared to confront. By the third week, the estate had normalized into a peculiar rhythm, neither abandoned nor governed, suspended between collapse and reconstruction. Marilla walked the grounds each morning, noting the shifting patterns of animal tracks, the way humidity condensed on windows, the slow disintegration of structures once maintained by strict discipline. It occurred to her that every piece of the land bore the imprint of someone's labor, whether forced or voluntary, and that the moral business of inheritance in such a place could never be clean. She did not know whether she would one day rebuild the estate into something equitable or allow nature to reclaim it entirely, and she felt no urgency to decide. Survival, for the moment, required only stillness and observation. In the final days of the month, a traveling preacher passed through the settlement and later recounted, in a widely repeated sermon, his impressions of a somber young woman who walked the abandoned halls of a great house with the steady confidence of someone unburdened by fear. His description filtered outward, embellishing itself with each retelling. Some said she was a tragic survivor, others that she was the silent architect of the tragedy. These stories eventually reached river towns and distant plantations, where they were received with fascination, skepticism, or alarm. Yet none who repeated the tale truly understood the woman at its center, for none had lived the years that shaped her silent resolve. Marilla understood that the full truth would remain lodged within her, unspoken and perhaps inexpressible. What mattered now was not confession but continuity, the ability to step into a future no longer dictated by the whims of those who had wielded power over every aspect of her existence. She felt the weight of her choices not as guilt but as consequence, and she accepted that survival, in any meaningful sense, demanded the willingness to carry consequences without flinching. She also understood the unsettling reality that justice, in the world she inhabited, was never pure and rarely gentle, and that those who hoped to achieve it without staining their hands were engaged in a fantasy reserved for distant observers, not participants. As the final light of dusk faded one evening, Marilla stood at the top of the main staircase, looking down into the foyer where shadows gathered like sediment settling at the bottom of a river. She realized, with a quiet clarity, that she was now the sole witness to the full sequence of what had occurred. The vanished, the dead, and the escaped had left behind fragments, documents, objects, bloodstains, possessions, but only she held the complete ledger of actions and reasons. Whether she chose to guard that ledger or one day reveal its darkest entries remained an unanswered question, one she would consider only when the time aligned with necessity. Before extinguishing the candle, she whispered, not as confession, but as acknowledgement, that the world often demanded a terrible price from those it forced to endure its cruelties. And she understood further that the price she had paid, and the one she had required others to pay, were woven into the same fabric of survival, indistinguishable except by those who sought to impose moral clarity upon realities that resisted such simplification. YouTube-style closing reflection. If you followed Marilla's journey to this point, let me ask you something directly. What would you have done? If the world cornered you, stripped you of choices, and offered you survival only through decisions that blurred the line between justice and vengeance, would you have stayed silent? Would you have acted differently? Or would survival itself have become your final form of justice? Tell me in the comments. Is survival at any cost still moral? Or is it simply human?